When it comes to self-sabotage, that thing that gets in the way of our lives, that makes us feel bad about ourselves, that makes us judge ourselves and wastes time and energy. When it comes to that, I actually think about it in three different ways. The first one you'll be really familiar with, but the other two, they're just ways in that can actually make a difference quite quickly. So the first one is what you probably know, and that's based on our conditioning and our triggers and our patterning and how we end up doing that thing, maybe people pleasing or controlling or being a perfectionist, avoiding. There are all sorts of names and labels for this sort of style of sabotage that we do for ourselves. And, the main thing is that we're not really engaging with life properly in those moments. We're playing a role. So that's the main one. That's probably the one that you've come across, hypnosis and all sorts of different methodologies. There are these other two, and of course, there's massive amounts of overlap. But I find these two really, really useful because they do give a way that we can actually very quickly catch ourselves and perhaps make a difference to that self-sabotage in the moment. The first one is a shift in worldview, becoming aware of the perspective that we're looking from. And very often, what we'll find is that if we can have some awareness around what our worldview is, we get a lot of information very quickly. We get information about who we're thinking we are, who we're thinking the other people or the situation is very, very quickly. And if we start to observe that a little bit in moments when we're not triggered, as well as moments when we are, then we can start to use it as a way to know what sort of state we're in and also to grow our thinking and our attitudes and our understanding about what's going on beyond what it is currently. So, it's not exactly self-sabotage, but you can see that if the orientation towards the world is really faulty, we're not going to be getting what we want. And unless we actually question and look towards that way of seeing things, well, let me put it another way around. If we start to look from that perspective, that we can actually change our worldview, we suddenly open up a whole realm of possibilities about how we can impact the ways our sabotage affects us, but also how we think about sabotage itself, self-sabotage. So that's the big picture. And that's a very, very useful way to start thinking about these patterns as they arise in our lives. At the very other end of the spectrum, we have small ways we can identify places where we're sabotaging ourselves in terms of efficiency. I'll give you one very simple example of this. If I go and cook and I make a wonderful meal, I may find myself at the end, this happens quite a lot, as you can see from that big sigh, I just end up with a lot of washing up at the end, and it's kind of, oh, it's not so fun. However, a huge efficiency gain is what I discovered way too late, actually, is I can wash up as I go along. And so that I've made the same meal in the same amount of time as it took to cook the meal, but most of the cleaning up is done by the time I sit down to eat. Not all, but most of it. So that's a very different kind of way of approaching sabotage. It's not exactly sabotage to be inefficient, but if we can start to identify these places where we can actually do something, it pulls us out a little bit of the self-sabotage helplessness. That kind of, oh, this has happened again. No, if we can find ways to actually find these efficiency, productivity gains in our daily lives, particularly as it relates to those areas where we maybe self-sabotage regularly, we can have a big impact, and it doesn't involve doing deep inner work for those times. And it can actually make it a little bit easier to do that inner work. So just to recap, the main way that we self-sabotage is this kind of trigger response, happens in our nervous system, happens through our conditioning, our subconscious patterns, whatever way you want to call it. And then these other two, which are related, one on the big picture of this kind of real perspective. Who am I showing up as? How am I perceiving the world? And then the small, what can I do to make things flow and be a bit more easy in my life? And by working on all three, you have something that you can use in the moment, out of the moment, with more sort of contemplative, more action-based, and together they just make it a little bit easier to move through and change our relationship to this self-sabotage so it becomes part of our creativity.